and thank you for joining this special joint event by the Australian National University and the University of Melbourne, in which we will hear from some of the top climate experts, all of them joint authors of the latest crucial report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I'm Mark Kenny, host of Democracy Sausage podcast, and of course I'm also from the ANU, specifically the Australian Studies Institute and the School of Politics and International Relations. Before getting down to business, can I take a moment to acknowledge the land from which I speak to you tonight, the traditional country of the Ngunnawal First Nations people, and I pay my respect to their elders past and present, and naturally I extend that respect to all First Nations people participating tonight. This event will have essentially three parts to it of roughly equal duration: a presentation on the IPCC report by Professor Mark Howden, followed by a panel discussion of the report with our two other panelists, Professor Bronwyn Haywood and Professor Catherine Bowen. That should account for about the first hour of the proceedings, and in the final half hour, there will be a chance for you to put questions to these brilliant experts using the Q&A function in the bottom panel. That is not the chat function, but the Q&A function. Please note that the Q&A is moderated, so please be sure to ask a question rather than perhaps make a comment, as some people have a tendency to do. And as you'd expect, any comments or inappropriate language that shouldn't be there will not make it through and will be deleted. So first to Professor Mark Howden. Mark Howden is the Director and the Head of the Climate Change at the ANU Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions, or ICEDS. He is also an Honorary Professor at Melbourne University, a Vice Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and is the Chair of the ACT Climate Change Council. He has been a major contributor to the IPCC since 1991, with roles in the second, third, fourth, fifth, and now the sixth assessment reports, sharing the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize with other IPCC participants, including Al Gore. Mark Howden, thank you. If I can invite you now to give us a summary of this IPCC report.
Thanks very much, Mark, and thanks to our co-collaborators, co-hosts for this, University of Melbourne, and really pleased to be able to speak here tonight. I'm just going to share my screen just to move into the presentation, and just checking you should be seeing a full screen. Perfect. So just before I start, I'd like to acknowledge my co-author on this, Mahalani Delaney, and also works at ANU, and to mention that we actually have on our website a whole series of fact sheets which have been prepared for the Pacific, but which actually are very pertinent to Australia. So if you want some more information, have a look at those fact sheets. And what I'm trying to do today is give a very quick skate over a massive report. So it's 3,600 plus pages, and I'm trying to cover the core elements of that in 20 minutes. And so the first thing I'd point out is that, that what we're dealing with here is actually one of multiple reports in this IPCC cycle. So the first of those reports was the 1.5 degrees report. A key quote from that is, it said, "We require urgent and unprecedented changes in every part of our society if we're to avoid 1.5 or 2 degrees. Then we had the land report, the oceans report, and then late last year we had the climate science report. And one of the key quotes associated with that was, "This is a code red for humanity." Then we fast forward to this, the Working Group 2 report on impacts and adaptation and vulnerability, and it was described by Antonio Guterres as an atlas of human suffering and a demonstration of the abject failure of leadership in relation to climate change. Now, a month from now, we have the IPCC's mitigation report, the emission reduction report, followed later this year by the synthesis report, and all of these parts of the IPCC's sixth assessment cycle feeding into the UN Global Stocktake next year, which essentially is saying, how well are we doing on climate change? And that's something you might want to consider as we finish this event tonight. So if we look at the statistics on this report, as I said, was a massive report. It was put together by 270 authors, something over 600 contributing authors from 67 countries, less than half were from developing countries, but more than previous reports. Less than half were women, but more than previous reports. So we're not where we should be, but we are getting slightly better over time. These authors put together some 34,000 different references in this report, and they dealt with over 62,000 comments from other scientists and governments, and each comment had to be dealt with individually, and then it's assessed by review editors to ensure that it's been effectively dealt with. And given that this report builds on the previous IPCC reports, I think it is fair to say it's our best understanding to date of the issues of climate change impacts, adaptation and vulnerability. And in part, that's because we just simply have more data since the fifth assessment report was published 8 years ago. And so that's the normal process of science. We accumulate more information and we have more clarity on the things that we're studying. But I think really importantly, in those 8 years since the fifth assessment report, at least 7 of those 8 years was the hottest year on record. And if you look at some of the global temperature records, all 8 of those years were the hottest 8 years on record. And so we've had lived experience of climate change since then, which I think has significantly changed our perspectives on climate change impacts and adaptation. Now, before I launch into the main part of this talk, I just want to draw your attention to this quote from Dan Kahneman, and it was actually Beck Colvin, my esteemed colleague, who actually first drew my attention to this. And basically he said that the human mind is not equipped to deal with climate change because it's distant, it's abstract, and it's contested. And I think if you actually think about what the Working Group 1 report has done, revealed, and what this Working Group report does, I actually raise a proposition that that is no longer true. So this is something for you to, again, to think about as I talk. Is it distant? Well, I would say no. What this shows is that climate change is impacting on every continent, every island, every ocean across the world, and it's doing it now. So it's not distant in either terms of geographical distance nor in terms of time. It's no longer abstract. This is real, it's significant, and it's meaningful. And it's no longer contested. What we actually saw in the Working Group 1 report was saying climate change or human influence on climate change is now unequivocal. It is a simple fact. And this report also concludes this. The scientific evidence of climate change impacts is unequivocal, and it's a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. And it also says that any further delay in concerted global action will miss a narrow window to secure a sustainable future for the people of this planet. And importantly, as I'll talk about, it offers solutions to climate change in the sense of adapting to the changes that we're experiencing and we anticipate further. Now, I'll only show one slide of what's already happened in terms of climate impacts because I haven't got the space to do more. But what this slide shows, it's drawn from something like 78,000 different studies, and it shows for each cell, each little square on that map is the accumulation of those studies which indicates influence of climate change on some system there. And you'll see that some places like the Sahara and Siberia are not well studied, so there's not a lot of evidence, but many other places are. And the cumulative evidence for this is massive, that climate change is already having impacts on the systems that we value. If we look at what the future changes might bring us, because that's particularly what we're concerned about. So heat stress. What we're likely to experience is massive increases in heat stress with impacts on our economy, on our physical well-being, and on our mental health. There's increasing evidence that heat stress and similar climate extremes impacts not only on acute events such as cyclones and storms and fires, but also from chronic events, long run events like long run droughts and sea level rise. We're likely to see water scarcity in many parts of the world, but not all the time and not everywhere. And what we see particularly is those areas where we're getting reduced snowmelt from ice and glacier cover are particularly likely to decline in water availability. But not just there, particularly across the mid-latitudes where Australia sits, South America, tip of South Africa, and the Mediterranean, we're all likely to see very significant reductions in water availability, but increases in water availability in some other places. We're likely to see very significant challenges to food security, and importantly, climate change will undermine not only the quantity of food, but also the quality of food that's consumed, particularly by poor people in developing countries. And lastly, there's a big risk in terms of flood. This won't come as a surprise, but people on small islands and in low-lying areas next to the oceans, such as parts of Indonesia or Bangladesh, are very prone to sea level rise and associated storms, which increase the risk from both. And there's something like 1 billion people across the globe who are likely to be affected significantly within this next century. And it's also things like human mortality. So these maps which come out here, the left-hand set of panels is for an intermediate climate change scenario. The right-hand is for a high emissions climate scenario. And we can see that going to a high emission scenario has significant increases in mortality and also avoided deaths. So the colours are more intense as we go to a high emission scenario. But what we can see here is a couple of things. One is, as we go through the century from the top down to the bottom, things get worse in those countries where it's likely to, we're going to have more deaths. But really importantly for me, what this shows is the difference in the green colours, which are about avoided deaths, and the red colours, which are about additional deaths. And we can see that that maps almost entirely, with the exception of Australia, on developing countries are the ones which have the red colours, and it's mostly developed countries which have the green colours. So this is just one thread of issues of equity, which this report points out, that those people who are already poor and disadvantaged in low income situations are probably going to be more poor and disadvantaged due to climate change. And Bronwyn will talk more about that. If we look at our natural systems, particularly our oceans, we see really significant impacts on animal biomass out into the future. On the left-hand side is a low emission scenario, and we can see that big parts of the global oceans have significant reductions in productivity, with some green parts where we might get increases, including to the east of Fiji, where this is largely due to migratory behaviours of some species. Whereas if we go to the right-hand side on a high emission scenario, we can see pretty much every ocean, again, with a few minor exceptions, is likely to have very significant reductions in animal biomass and productivity under a high emission scenario, with huge implications for food security and nutrition, as well as for the functioning of those ecosystems throughout our global oceans. And when we aggregate all of this into these sorts of diagrams, which look at the aggregate impacts of climate change, in this case on human systems, if we see down the left-hand side, this is for global systems or different regions like Africa and Asia and Australasia. So all of those geographical splits are down the left-hand side. And on the top are different issues or sectors. So impacts on water and food, impacts on health and well-being, impacts on cities and infrastructure. And the thing that I draw your attention to is there is no single cell in that whole matrix where there is just a plus. Virtually all of the cells are filled by a minus. So they're assessed as being net negative impacts from climate change. And those cells which do have a plus and a minus, that's the only place where the pluses occur. So for those cells, in some places there's likely to be a benefit, but other places there's likely to be a disbenefit of climate change. So the overall picture that we get from this report is the assessed impact of climate change is significantly negative across most systems and most places on Earth. Now, another way of looking at these implications is by what we call the burning embers diagrams or risk diagrams. So what this shows is on the left-hand side, it shows different emission scenarios going from the low emission scenarios down the bottom, the high emission scenarios up the top, and the temperatures associated with those. So the low emission scenarios keep temperatures basically down below 2 degrees, and the high emission scenarios above that. Now, what these bars, the burning embers bars, show is the different colours associated with different risks. So a clear colour is essentially no risk, as it goes through the yellows to the reds to the very dark reds or purpley colours, we go up to moderate, high and very high risk. And a very high risk in this type of assessment is essentially irreversible and unmanageable. And we see for these different categories, which have been used ever since these burning embers were devised back in the third assessment report. So that shows, for example, the left-hand side is essentially the biodiversity or ecosystem ember. And what that shows is that if we go to 1.5 degrees, we're in the the high risk category. Once we get to the 2 degrees, we're essentially in the very high, irreversible and unmanageable category. But that risk at any given temperature is very different for different risks. The adjacent bar is associated with extreme weather conditions, and you can see that we have a slightly different risk profile for that. And as we go to things like the distribution of impacts or global aggregate impacts, again, we have a different risk profile. If we look at what that might be for Australia, we see here the same sort of burning embers, but one of them, the right-hand ember, has what would the risk might be under some degree of adaptation, so some degree of response to climate change. And here we have, for example, the risk ember for the coral reefs, the tropical coral reefs, and we can see that even at the temperatures we're currently at, 1.1 degrees, the assessed risk is right on that edge of that very high, irreversible and unmanageable category. And as we go further up in terms of temperature, it just gets worse. Whereas if we look at the alpine biodiversity, it's still high risk, but not quite so high at a given temperature. And if we look, for example, at heat-related mortality on the right-hand side, we can see that that high risk only starts to cut in around 2 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. Now, really importantly, what this report also delved into was the issues of complex and cascading risks. And for different issues and sectors and jurisdictions, it outlined some of those complex and cascading risks. So a complex risk is where you have multiple things working and interacting with each other. So, for example, droughts and shortage of water, high temperatures and fire, a set of complex risks that interact with each other. And cascading risks are where you have one risk which sets off another, which triggers another. So, for example, fires, which then trigger off like loss of electricity, which then triggers off a loss of mobility because people can't get petrol out of their petrol pumps down on the south coast. And there's no communication system, so they can't message each other and coordinate. And so you get these cascading risks. And so that's identified for the first time effectively in this report. Now, the second part of the report is about the adaptation response. So if the first part is about the concern, this part of the report is about the hope that we can actually at least offset some of the negatives of climate change. So what this says is to avoid mounting losses, we need to have urgent and enhanced activity on adaptation. And at the same time, we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. This is not either or, this is and. We need to do both. Now, what we did, there's many different parts of this, but one of the things we did was we put together this feasibility assessment. So I don't expect you to read all of this, so I'll just blow up part of that table. And so what we have down the left-hand side is different systems that we're interested in, the system transitions, the adaptation. So in this case, it's the land and ocean and ecosystem transitions. And we have a series of different risks associated with those, for example, water security or food security. And then we have a set of different responses or adaptations. So for example, water use efficiency and water resource management. And then for each of those adaptations, using the exact information in the scientific literature, we assess the potential feasibility based on these different dimensions of feasibility, such as economic, technological, institutional, and social dimensions of feasibility. And we come up with some aggregate assessment of feasibility of those types of adaptation responses, and also the synergies of those with emission reduction. So do they work together, or does adaptation and mitigation work against each other? And you can see that there's variation in that across different categories. So, for example, water use efficiency doesn't necessarily correspond with enhanced emission reduction. So before we get sort of too carried away that we can adapt our way out of this, we need to recognise there's adaptation limits, adaptation barriers, limits to adaptation finance, and potential for maladaptation to deal with. So, for example, what this report says quite clearly is that there is actually a narrowing window for action. As temperature is increased, the number of adaptation options which are feasible decreases and their effectiveness decreases. So the lower we keep our temperature, the more things we have on the table in terms of adapting. The higher we let the temperature rip, the fewer adaptation options and the more costs we're going to bear from climate change. There's also limits to adaptation. So often adaptation has either soft limits or hard limits. So the example here is people living on small islands or those dependent on glaciers and snowmelt may no longer be able to adapt once they're past 1.5 degrees because of things like sea level rise or lack of water. By 2 degrees, we anticipate that many farming areas which are currently productive will become very challenging to farm under our existing farming systems, requiring significant change and possibly loss of productivity. But it's really important to note that even if we adapt these systems really well, there's very likely to be residual losses and damages. So we're going to be putting up with pain regardless of how well we adapt, is the assessment from this report. We can reduce some of that pain by ensuring that we actually have adequate finance to help people adapt and adapt effectively. But the assessment again was that these current financial flows are insufficient to deal with climate change. And of those financial flows across the globe that are dealt with for climate response, what is actually delivered to climate adaptation is a very, very small slice of the pie. And in fact, this assessment analysed it was only between 4 and 8% of the global finance actually ends up being in the adaptation category. And lastly, we need to be very alert to maladaptive responses which generate either bad results out of perhaps increased greenhouse gas emissions, or generate lock-in, which increases future vulnerability or causes other social or environmental harms. So we need to be very careful about how we adapt. It's not just something that's going to be easy to do. But even when we look at what's happening in terms of adaptation across the globe, what we see is there's increasing gaps between the adaptation action taken and what's needed. And those gaps are largest amongst low-income populations, and they're expected to grow under climate change. So that says that we need to accelerate climate adaptation. And here's a few elements of that acceleration laid out in the report. Adaptation is much more likely to be accelerated when you have strong political commitment and follow through across all levels of government and integration of activities across all levels of government, where you have effective institutional frameworks which have clear goals and priorities that define the responsibilities of the different actors and how they can interact, where you have enhanced knowledge of both the risks and of the adaptation options to improve the responses, where we have effective monitoring and evaluation of adaptation measures, because we're not going to get this right first time, every time. And this is going to be a long journey over many decades. So we need to put in place the learning processes so we do things better and better over time, particularly better and better under a changing environment. And lastly, as I think Bronwyn will talk about, we need much more focus on inclusive governance that prioritizes justice, equity, and inclusion. That's participation by affected stakeholders. And the last point I'd make is that effective adaptation responses to climate change are essential if we're to meet the Sustainable Development Goals that the Australian government and most governments across the world have signed up to. So what this figure shows is, again, different system transitions, different adaptation options, but looking at how they impact on different sectors and groups at risk and whether they're synergistic or otherwise with the Sustainable Development Goals. So those are the different colours over here with the little crosses in each cell. And one of the really hopeful things about this report, I think, is that when you look at those cells where you have single adaptation options and the interaction with sustainable development, in most cases, we actually have a plus in the cell, which actually means that there's a synergy that we can build from and accelerate adoption of the climate response as well as the other sustainable development goals. So I think there's some really good news here that if we act in a more integrated way, we can deal with this much more effectively. But that integration is really crucial. We need to have adaptation working with mitigation and working with sustainable development. And that's what this report called climate resilient development. And when we look at the evidence across the globe, climate resilient development is already being challenged by the climate changes we're already seeing. And the prospects for climate resilient development will become increasingly challenging unless we pay due attention to them in the coming decades. And if warming exceeds 1.5 degrees, it's going to become extremely complicated, and over 2 degrees, it becomes extremely difficult. So I'll just leave it there, but just reiterating one of the key messages that Beck Colvin and I developed after the 1.5 degrees report, and that is every half a degree matters. Every fraction of warming makes things harder for us. Every year matters. Action is urgent. We need to act now, and we need to act well. And every choice that we make matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for that. Thank you, Mark, for that very compelling and really excellent presentation. That really, I think, was extremely clear and very concise. And as you say, a huge task to get through so much detail in a relatively short time. But I think you did a fabulous job of explaining the nature of the work that's been done, just conveying how rigorous and how detailed that work is, how vital it is, and you gave us a very good sense of, as you say, the sort of closing window, the way even the difficult tasks that the world faces right now are becoming more and more difficult with every element of delay that's been built in. And there has been plenty of delay, as we all know, in this process, plenty of reluctance really by the world to accept these changes, to accept the changes necessary, and to start making the hard decisions to prepare for it. And ironically, that means harder decisions, as you say, are needed down the track, or they're needed now, and they're going to be even harder down the track. Let's move on now really to the panel phase of our session tonight. And it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Bronwyn Haywood and Professor Catherine Bowen. Bronwyn Haywood is a professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Canterbury. Her research focuses on the intersection of sustainable development, youth, climate change, and citizenship. Professor Haywood is a lead author of the IPCC AR6 report, Cities and Infrastructure, and was a lead author of the 2018 Special Report on 1.5, Sustainable Development and Poverty Eradication. And Catherine Bowen is professor in the Melbourne School of Global and Population Health. She works at the nexus of global environmental change, global health and governance issues, primarily in low and middle income settings. Professor Haywood holds several key international roles, including as lead author on the IPCC 6th Assessment Report. She regularly advises the World Health Organization on climate change and health, as well as other national and international organizations. So you can see, welcome to you both, I should say first, and you can see that all three of our speakers tonight are very well qualified to be taking us through the challenges that we face and the work that's been done to try and quantify that and guide us forward. Catherine Bowen, I might start with you. And I might make an obvious point, I suppose, given that we have these East Coast floods savaging the lives and livelihoods of so many. And again, we see this disconnect, although many people are making it, but governments have struggled to make it, and they've probably struggled around the world, but we certainly know a fair bit about that in Australia. I just wonder if you have a theory as to why there is such a big disconnect between our lived experience of climate change and our political discourse, and perhaps our somewhat reluctant policy settings. And I suppose that's going back over some of the ground we've just discussed. And Mark had that particularly good quote from, I think it was Daniel Kahneman, who made the point that it's distant and it's, what was it, distant and abstract and contested, I think, were the three things. But I wonder if you have a feeling about why it is that we have this massive disconnect in our politics and our policy.
Thanks, Mark, and I appreciate that you've started me on a very easy question, so many thanks for that. But before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm coming from the lands of the Boonwurrung people, the unceded lands here, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and really acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowing and Indigenous being in relation to how we actually come to terms with the way that our planet is being treated and how we develop the appropriate responses. I'd also quickly, before I address your question, note that this report and our discussion tonight is very sobering, and it's very challenging for many of us to keep hearing about. And so I just suggest that if you haven't already thought of something fun and enjoyable to do after you've watched this conversation, please jot down something that you might be able to do after this, whether that's a nice walk around the block, or whether that's a chat with your kids. But it's really important that we look after ourselves and our health and our well-being, and you probably would expect that from me being on the health chapter. But to your point, I think, Mark, what we're seeing is, again, we use this word disconnect. So we're seeing that the majority, if we look at the Australian population, then there was a recent survey just in the last few months by the Australian Conservation Foundation that noted that I think it was more than 80% wanted action on climate change. And so there's absolutely a groundswell of community enthusiasm and willingness for action. And it's the response at a political level, as you point to. And really, the report actually does address, really for one of probably the strongest time in its history, in the IPCC's history, about the need for political commitment and political will as one of the most important enabling factors in order for us to progress. So this is something that all of us on this panel and many other people who work in this field talk about incessantly. We know so much in terms of the solutions that we have at hand. We have these available, and really the fundamental missing link is the political will and the commitment. And to have this outlined in such clarity in this report, assessed by the literature, is a really powerful statement. I think also we need to be reminded of the fact that our government, along with 160 odd other governments, have approved this report, and specifically the summary for policymakers. So our government has seen this report, and really, it's up to each of us in terms of how we start to think about addressing this issue around political will. And I need to remember that I'm coming tonight from you in a position as IPCC lead author, and so our we're somewhat limited in terms of what we can say. We're representing the report, but the main thing to say is that political will is identified as one of the key enabling factors for moving forward. I don't know if Bronwyn would like to add anything to that as well, or whether you have another easy question for me.
Look, I do have a sort of a health-related question for you, but I'd be very happy, Bronwyn, if you would like to, and indeed, Mark, if you'd like to comment about that. I mean, obviously, there is, for everyone who's been working in this area and looking at the data and worrying about this for a long time and talking about it, and we've seen a succession of reports as we've been discussing. There's a level of understandable frustration at that what I say that sort of disconnect is. So. If you have any comments on that. Bronwyn, you first.
Yeah, I think as a political scientist looking at this report and working on it, there are some things that are significantly different. So yes, the report itself is quite strong when it talks about the need for political commitment and the need for political will. It talks in the language of science about trade-offs, where we're really meaning the very difficult political decisions we've got to make with our investments, with our very large funding, and the effects of these decisions are now difficult. But at the same time, as Catherine says, there's some quite remarkable things about this report that are really striking. One is that nearly 160 countries have actually signed off for the first time a recognition that climate change has human rights implications, and it's a debate about justice, and that the best practice research is showing us that the way to make decisions that are effective are to prioritise the poor and to make decisions in equitable partnership. Now, for countries to sign that off, when you think that just 5 to 10 years ago, we were struggling to get them to agree that climate was even a thing that was happening as a change, is significant. And while it feels like it's moving so slowly, at another level, this is adding a layer of evidence. And when the UN Secretary General says that these are criminal issues, he doesn't choose that language lightly. We're starting to enter a new era of thinking about how we tackled climate much more seriously, I think.
Mark, do you think that, in a sense, and this is a sort of a grim reality, really, but going back to the point about the floods, and we've of course had the bushfires, we had the droughts that preceded the bushfire crisis of a couple of years ago. We're seeing increased frequency of these extreme weather events. That the sort of deniers or the policy reluctant political establishment is, in a sense, becoming mugged by reality. It's a horrible way for it to happen, I suppose, but it's a reality. And we see this being a key discussion, particularly in the bushfires that affected this part of the world where you and I live, a couple of years ago, and now with these floods, very strong commentary around the frequency of these floods. And it has the potential, I suppose, in the end, to no longer, as you so rightly said, it's no longer distant and it's no longer abstract, even if in some residual way it's still contested.
Yeah, look, it's a really good point, Mark, and just to sort of draw on what Catherine said before, so the Lowy Institute report, over several years now shows 90% of Australians want more action on climate change. And the political realities in most jurisdictions have been quite different from that. And so that gap between what the populace wants and what they're getting is actually just closing very slowly. And so my own view is that in a representative democracy, that's an unsustainable situation. So we'll continue to see that gap close. But in the process, we're not only incurring unnecessary risk, associated with those fires and similar extreme events, we're actually missing out on opportunities because, to some extent, we've got our head in the sand and we're actually not on the front foot in terms of either being very structured in how we can avoid those risks, doing more effective adaptation, better floodplain management, for example. And similarly, we're not getting the best out of our emission reduction opportunities. So, going down the superpower road in the way that we could. So at the moment, we're not acting in our best interests as a nation, I would argue, and that needs to change. And I think that's the political reality which is forcing, the movements that you've just mentioned.
Yes. Back to you, Catherine. In this, as I foreshadowed, I had a sort of a health angle to talk to you about. Again, it's related, I suppose, or at least I'll start off making reference to the floods at the moment. The flooding crisis in Australia. Obviously, there's the immediate danger of drowning and everything that high water represents. But now there's also talk of, toxic molds in significant quantities. There's mosquito-borne diseases. I mean, really just, I think, bringing home to the population how threatening this whole circumstance is. What are the main messages coming out of the report in terms of the health challenges of climate change?
Thanks, Mark, and apologies with the tram going down there. But I suppose the three main messages, and you've touched on them a little bit, is that the first one is that the health impacts of climate change are increasing. The literature is showing this. So whether this is, as you say, direct impacts from heat, death and illness, or whether it's more indirect through, for example, and we can look to Northern New South Wales and Queensland for examples of, the destruction of crops and agriculture, and then the flow-on effects that this has on individual and household livelihoods, and the economic health and well-being of families and communities, and the breakdown of communities as well in some instances. So these are what we call indirect impacts on health. And so when we start to think about these more indirect impacts that don't get a lot of the coverage, it's more about the direct, how many people have died, how many people are in hospital, but we really pay far less attention to these indirect, more insidious impacts that tend to really go on for a much longer period of time. And also mental health, as Mark foreshadowed earlier, is one of the key it's not a new issue for us, but it's a new issue in terms of the amount of literature that's now available to be able to assess. So mental health has come through this report stronger than ever. So that's really the first key message, is that these impacts are increasing. The second message is really that we can reduce many of the risks to human health and well-being if we adapt and mitigate, as Mark said, concurrently. So if we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions urgently, and if we strengthen our adaptation responses, and particularly so that our adaptation responses are proactive rather than reactive. And that's obviously an enormous discussion we can also have, particularly in light of what we're seeing up in Northern New South Wales. And if we know that these are effective, and Mark also really helpfully pointed to that feasibility study as well within the IPCC's assessment, to look at each adaptation response and how feasible these might be. And again, I mean, Mark provided a wonderful overview of the general themes across the report in relation to health financing. So we know that there's 4 to 8% of climate financing directed to adaptation. When it comes to the financing that's directed to health, it's 0.5%. So this is an issue for the health sector in terms of increasing its investments, particularly from international multilateral finance. And that's an adaptation gap. That's what we would call one of our adaptation gaps for the health sector. And so then the third key message, I suppose, out of the report is really around the rapid transformations that we need to ensure that we do develop in a way that's climate resilient and sustainable. And so this is an opportunity for the health sector to start to recognise and more strongly work in partnership with what we call health determining sectors. And I use, if I go back to my example around the floods in Northern New South Wales and Queensland, the impacts on crops and livelihoods, the importance of linking with agriculture sector, the water sector, the urban design sector. It's dealing with any of these health issues demands a interdisciplinary and cross-sectoral approach. And this will reduce the vulnerability to the climate-related health risks. And on that point around rapid transformation, the final thing I'd like to say is that these transformational changes that we need to see will be much more effective if they're responsive to regional and local and Indigenous knowledge. So that's a bit of a snapshot of the main messages from the health chapter.
Yes, that's really fascinating. And it occurred to me as you were talking that one of the other elements, and this is not strictly a health question, this is more of going back to what we were talking about at the beginning, about the politics of it, I suppose, but there are dangers to the health of the democracy resulting from these mega disasters that occur in widespread areas. And the sort of loss of faith in government itself, in government's ability to protect and respond in these circumstances. If we think back to Hurricane Katrina, for example, and the kind of political fallout going way back in the US, but also with the bushfires that we've referred to, and now with the disquiet that's coming from people, it's not a health dimension, but it's an aspect of the overall health of our society and our government. If governments can't deal with this, perhaps that's something for a political scientist, Bronwyn Hayward, to comment on. Yes. Sorry. Did I? Did I just throw a question to you while you were writing something down?
Yeah, I was just thinking about it because I was thinking about it in another way, that in the cities context, we've been thinking about this a lot in the report, and all the research is showing that our cities and our governments, both national and state, regional and local, are really, really struggling to cope at the moment, and that's going to increase. And that's struggling at multiple levels, struggling with finance, they're struggling with planning and implementation on the ground. And as you say, they're struggling with diverse populations who are experiencing this risk differently. So it's glib to say that this is a challenge for governance, but it is a huge challenge. And actually that's what got me into the whole area of climate, because one of the things I'm most interested in my own research is how do we maintain democracy through periods of great turmoil? So that, and how do we do that, especially so that children have a democratic as well as a sustainable future? But so yes, so I was just a bit thrown because I was listening and thinking, yes.
Yeah, well, I mean, you've answered it extremely well, because that was exactly what I was thinking about, and it was if I can offer an excuse, it was entirely an improvised thought from me as well, as I was thinking about just the scale of these disasters and how it affects our society. Let's just stay with something you mentioned there, though, cities. What does this report have to say about the particular challenges for cities arising out of climate change?
Well, cities has become quite a feature of this report, partly because urbanisation is one of the big global megatrends, and there are several system shifts that are focused on in the studies where we are seeing really big shifts. But already half the world lives in cities. We're expecting another 2.5 billion people to move into cities, especially kind of medium-sized cities, by 2050. And what the report's saying overall is that there's somewhere around 3.5 billion people who are now highly vulnerable to climate change now. And then add on top of that, that cities are a crucible of risk. So many of the issues are concentrated in cities. And I'm sorry, I think I might be breaking up a little bit, but hopefully it's all right. So one of the things is that we're not all in it together. As Catherine and Mark have said, it's the most vulnerable, the poorest, the elderly, Indigenous, ethnic minorities and disabled, and children who are particularly at risk when we're looking at cities. And as we've talked about in different contexts, the study and the summaries are very upfront about the fact that we're rapidly reaching the limits of what we can cope with. And that's limits both the soft in terms of what's feasible right now and the actual hard in terms of not being able to adjust to intolerable risk. And I mean, I just look at, for Australia at the moment, or here we've just had repeated flooding on the West Coast. This is extremely stressful for communities, as you say. And so when we talk about cascading or compounding risks, that's kind of theoretical in the studies. But the reality means that you might be living in a city with extended heat days, plus a problem of air quality, meaning, as Catherine said, you know, often the direct health effects in cities are hidden because we would register a number of deaths as immediately heat related, but then if you take something like the wildfires, I was just reading through the Australia-New Zealand chapter that Brendan Mackey and Judy Lawrence have led, and there are some things that are really striking about it. The wildfires from 2019, 2020, you know, 33 deaths immediately, and then another 429 from respiratory and related cardio illnesses. Now, this is a lot for communities. And I think the part, and I'm sorry that it's so grim just at the moment, because it is grim, as Catherine said, on top of a war, on top of a pandemic. But I think the bit that's really stuck with me from this report is that children born this year, if we cross 1.5, which the report is suggesting is likely in the near term, so 2030s, Mark can correct me, but we're sort of thinking that if we're on this trajectory, that's where we will be, then in a child's lifetime, by the time they're 80 at the end of the century, they'll have experienced 4 times the rate of these severe disasters and risks. That's really difficult. So for cities, one of the key problems is, as you say, how do we manage this? And what the research is showing is that the good news since we did the last stock take is that many more cities have plans about adaptation, but the bad news is not so many have implemented them. And when we are implementing the practice, it tends to be quite small scale, and our focus has really been on our physical infrastructure. And that matters. I mean, sea walls matter, but if you're concentrating only on that, then you risk, as Mark says, maladaptation. You start encouraging people to build in inappropriate places. It's not helping your poorest. So the research is also showing over the last 5 years that the key kinds of infrastructure we need to be thinking about is this, what they're calling the social infrastructure, but that's your income, insurance, your health, your education, support, all the things that are put at risk by these big disasters we're watching, plus working with nature to try and design cities that are greener, not only to keep cooler, but to absorb more of the flooding, those kind of multiple benefits. But again, we can do a lot with ecosystem planning and working with nature, but as our temperatures increase over 1.5, we reach the limits of what nature can start really helping us with. So we have to be doing both things at the same time in the next decade. We have to be reducing our emissions and protecting our communities, preferably in actions that come together. It's a tough ask, but it's the only option we've got.
Are we pushing also up against the limits, at least in the way we've currently configured them, of states, of governments themselves? Because, I mean, you make the point about the low level of investment for capital flows or investment flows for adaptation, even less for health, you know, quite a bit less. And of course, these problems are, as the term has been used a few times tonight, they're sort of complex and cascading potentially. The situation has a very bad trajectory to it if not addressed. That investment flow presumably is a function of where people think there's a return on money at the moment. Are there limits to the way we can do things if we are still running this kind of neoliberal idea that governments have to remain small and leave everything up to the market?
Well, certainly, I was surprised that there was agreement from both governments with the report finding that we can't leave our urban planning to a market-led approach and a highly energy intensive, and that's explicitly stated in the summary. And what they're saying is that one of the key things we can do is land use planning, and that land use planning is boring, it's frustrating, but it has a huge benefit in terms, and particularly when it's targeted at improving the lives of your most vulnerable, that it's one of the things that makes the biggest well-being dividends overall. So that's some of the good news, but funding it is difficult. We have very little private funding for adaptation. We do need to think about how the report's quite clear that the models that are being developed that have different kinds of partnerships need to be what they're calling equitable, integrated and inclusive, working with your local community, your state, your nation. It's going to need different ways of thinking about international financings, especially for the Pacific, for example, just in our region. But it is really expensive, but it's expensive not to do something like this. I mean, one of the other little bits that really stood out from the Australian chapter when I was reading it was that in the last decade, every year in Australia, the losses and damage for infrastructure has been about $18.2 billion a year. And the projected impacts are around about, by 2050, if we continue, are about 91 billion. So when the report says investing now for the projected future, not building for the disasters that we've had, but for the projected, is our best use of money, is critical.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. Mark, we're going to have to go quite soon to questions, but I've got a couple for you quickly if I can. One relates to the point you made about complex and cascading risks. And you made a very good point about how when things get complex, that becomes quite hard to predict, hard to model. How big a problem is that we get interaction of systems and circumstances in ways that we can't even fully conceive of yet, let alone quantify?
Yeah, it's a good question, Mark. And so what we often see is that we're quite wise after the fact in terms of the nature of some of those risks. So you mentioned toxic mold and mosquito-borne diseases, and so when it happens, we go, oh yeah, of course. But we mightn't have thought of that beforehand unless we've experienced it before, in which case it's on our list, to-do list to manage. So what I think is there's a challenge in terms of the conceptualization. There's a challenge in terms of prediction, and I'm actually not sure that prediction is the critical thing here, but I think it's actually much more about building the right sort of capabilities to respond when needed. And the challenge with that is when we get those complex risks, they often compound. Like it's not as though you just get a fire in one part of Eastern Australia, the whole of the East Coast goes up, and so your capacity is stretched. You can't shift firefighters from one place or the other. And in the past, we could actually do that with internationally. We could bring firefighters from California to Australia in their off season when it was our fire season, and vice versa. But because both of our fire seasons have stretched, we can no longer do that. They haven't got spare equipment. They haven't got spare people because they're fighting fires at the same time we are. So I think there's a real significant challenge in terms of simply when these things hit, they're hitting multiple sort of components of that complex risk, and they're all hitting together, and often it's big scale. And so we need to almost like lift our whole conceptualization of risk management from a small regional sectoral thing. This is a job for the SES, this is a job for the Army, and have a much more integrated response. And on that topic, I just think it's probably becoming increasingly clear that just calling out the Army left, right, and centre to deal with extreme events is not a sustainable proposition when we've got a country to defend and a region to engage with in terms of upskilling in terms of defence. So we need really to think a lot about this, and as Bronwyn said, as an economic cost, this is just mounting and mounting, and at the same time we're actually building in future vulnerabilities by some of our activities. Building more houses on floodplains just puts people in harm's way, puts infrastructure in harm's way, and we continue to do that. And so the first rule of getting out of a hole is stop digging, and we haven't stopped digging yet.
Yes, an interesting point. You talk about economic costs. I think there's a sense, and I referred to this right at the top, but there's a sense of there being a quite growing political cost. Even today, the Prime Minister, fresh out of his own isolation because of COVID, and has visited the flood-affected areas, some of them, and has had to sort of forthrightly state that Australia is becoming a harder place to live in. These terms like 1 in 500 or 1 in 100 year floods or droughts or whatever are starting to become quite misleading with the frequency of these events. And, look, some people are going to say this is a degree of greenwashing by a coalition that is in trouble and heading toward an election. But even if that is the case, it is a recognition, I think, of the point that Catherine made in the beginning about just the sheer community weight behind this issue. And that leads me to the last question I'll go to with you, Mark, before throwing open to our audience. And that is because I think, and Catherine will probably like this, is there something to be optimistic about here? I mean, are we starting to see, slow and frustrating though it might have been for those of us who've been banging on about this for a long time, but are we starting to see the cranking machinery of our government and management systems, reconfiguring to confront this challenge? Or am I being, naive?
Yeah. Was that a question to me, Mark?
It is a question to you, Mark.
Yeah. Look, I guess what we're changing to is aimlessly wandering to muddling through at the moment. So it's a bit of an improvement, but we're probably not doing the clear, crisp, strategic sort of thing that we perhaps we've probably known about for at least a decade, possibly 2 decades. We've known enough about climate change to really start to forge that vision and that capacity to deal with. But in terms of positives, and I think it is important, and I actually did frame my talk. There was a part of the talk which was about the concern part, and then there was a part of the talk which is about the hope part, and that hope part really is about how we can position ourselves to adapt to climate change, so we don't have the accumulating problems that we will run into if we're not careful, if we're not strategic about this. And when we look at the emerging economic analysis, by and large, that shows that action on climate change is, in a sense of both emission reduction and avoidance of impacts through adaptation, is around about 1/10 of what you incur if you don't act on climate change. So not acting on climate change is incredibly expensive at an aggregate level, and so it's actually in our economic interests, it's in our national interests, in our human interests, in our environmental interests to take this seriously. So and one example of how you can see this in a positive. So we know that our cities are heating up faster than the area around them. So we've got an urban heat island element there. We know that under extreme conditions, those particularly parts of the cities, often with the lower income parts of the cities, suffer a lot more in terms of heat stress and all of the health issues that Catherine was talking about. And so Western, going back to the period of Black Summer, Western Sydney was just shy on 50 degrees, temperature, like extraordinary, Death Valley type temperatures in Western Sydney. And so we know we should rightly be concerned about this, but we also know how to fix a lot of this. So we can green our cities, we can put trees and grass back into our cities, which keeps the temperature down. We can build heat reflective roads. We've got the technology to do that. We can mandate that houses don't have black roofs on them. We actually put light coloured roofs. We can build better houses. We know how to build houses which are good for the Australian environment now and in the future, but we just don't do it. We're stuck with old housing designs and materials rather than what we know we can do. And there's pathways through all of those things, but it means change. And to date, we've been a bit reluctant to grab that nettle and do that change. And yet, if we did, we'd all be much better off for it.
Can I just add something to
yes, Catherine.
Mark on that? I think that what gives me hope is looking at the city's scale, and there's so much incredible work that is happening at the city scale. But also, if we think about scales in Australia, the states and the territories, that they're the jurisdictions that are really ploughing ahead in terms of action. So despite challenges at the federal level, and this is a statement of fact, then it's really wonderful to see the progress that's happening across the country at smaller scales, so subnational and city scales, and there's a really wonderful work going on. Mark, your example around greening cities, there's some great examples of Adelaide and Melbourne doing terrific work in that. Canberra has really set the bar in terms of a carbon neutral city, and there's really wonderful examples. So despite the inaction at other scales, there's a really terrific progress.
Yes, and hopefully that's...
I know you want to go to questions.
Bronwyn, is that reflected globally as well?
Yeah, I know you want to go to questions, but I was just going to say, yes, about the cities, and a good example is Australia's lead in its water planning for cities. There's still a lot to do. But I think the other thing that really is striking to me, well, there's two. In the report, we talk about it, that the student movements and the Indigenous movements globally have changed the conversation. So they've shifted the conversation from being a very technical, scientific, technocratic conversation that people found difficult to enter into, to a moral question about what's fair, about what leadership looks like. And it doesn't take long to flip a country and a political stance once you have those conversations. That's not in the report. This is just me speaking from a politics point of view.
It's a really good point, though, because it flipped from being, as you say, that kind of technocratic discussion to one capable of moving people emotionally, in a sense, when you start thinking
emotionally
about it
and politically. And that's noted in much of the literature that's been reviewed here. And it is a very powerful shift.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. Let's go to some questions now. The first one's from Rowan Burns, I should say. Rowan says, given the new war in Ukraine and the likely increasing cost of fossil fuel, is now a good time to fund EV vehicles here in Australia? So I suppose what we're talking about there is a direct subsidy. Who would like to take that?
I can pick some of that up.
Away you go, Mark.
Look, probably 3 years ago was a time to step up our game on electric vehicles, but now is the second or third best time. We are lagging behind where other countries are. So in other countries, I think globally, 1 in every 10 vehicles which is sold is now an EV, and we're way below that, in spite of the fact that we're usually a early adopter country of technology. And there's all sorts of reasons sitting behind that. And when we look at various state governments, and Catherine's rightly pointed out that a whole series of state governments are very proactive in terms of climate action. Various state governments have actually done things like given essentially subsidies or removed stamp duty or registration to facilitate people buying electric vehicles. And I think that's a really positive move. The bigger move that could happen is essentially just setting performance standards or fuel standards. So, what other countries have done is saying to a particular maker of car, saying that on average, your cars that you sell have to be 4 litres per 100 kilometres fuel consumption. And so what that does is it forces those companies to bring in electric vehicles and low fuel consumption vehicles, sell them cheaper so that they can actually meet that requirement. And that means they often tend to put up the prices a little bit of their petrol-driven vehicles to compensate. But what it does is it accelerates the adoption very quickly, and it's a market-driven thing, and it doesn't cost the taxpayer money.
Yes, it's a very good point. Next question is from Angela Frimberger. The burning ember graph, Angela notes, for coral reefs, alpine forest, etc., seems to me, she says, to imply that adaptation offers little protective effect for wild ecosystems. Is that a correct reading? I suppose that's one for you, Mark.
Yeah, look, I can respond there as well. Fairly much is that those ecosystems often, very large areas. We tend to leave them alone. We actually want wilderness, and so as soon as you start intervening, you start to compromise the values, which sometimes are there, and it would be very expensive. So in the case of coral reefs, there's quite a bit of research going on about not just how to get reef organisms to adapt, so understand the heat stress response better and try to find genetic combinations of the plant and the animal that makes up a coral that are more heat adapted. But also looking at research that reduces other threatening processes. So in the case of the reefs, there's sedimentation and nutrients are particularly threatening processes. In other parts of the world, pollution and damaging fisheries practices can also be damaging reefs. So I think with those sorts of approaches, you can take a little bit of the edge off climate impacts in some systems, but in those largely natural systems, it's pretty marginal, given our current resourcing and knowledge.
Okay. Now, this is a fairly long question. I hope you'll bear with me for it, from Sue Meek. The lack of public response from the federal government to the confronting findings of the IPCC report is deafening. Their characterisation of what is happening as a result of at least partly climate change influence sequential East Coast lows as a national emergency, with its wrongful implications of being unexpected and unlikely to occur again, suggests that the message of the inevitability of increased extreme weather events is still not understood. Are you and your fellow authors getting any opportunity to provide behind the scenes briefings to government. Mark or Catherine?
Well, I think Mark actually would be well positioned to add a lot more detail to this question, but I just wanted to firstly note that a lot of the requests that do come from the Parliament come from our members that don't need convincing, if I can put it that way. So, for example, I was asked to speak at Parliament in Canberra. Gosh, it was when I could travel. So it was sometime in, must have been beginning of 2020. And I spoke to the now I have to get this right, the cross-parliamentary Friends of Climate Change group. And this was predominantly made up of Labor and the Greens. And I think there were a sprinkling of LNP MPs there too. But I think that sometimes the challenge is that the requests that we have for these briefings are generally from sympathetic ears. But Mark, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Very much so, is that the people who tend to accept the briefings are those who are already sort of on the sort of pathway to effective sort of climate change considerations, or at least dallying with that. The short answer is yes, I have briefed a few ministers, and there's invitations to briefings which have been sent out, but not necessarily responded to. Again, the dynamics of the party room are such that the key actors, which are to some extent limiting action on climate change, are, in my view, highly unlikely to accept a briefing.
It's an interesting point, isn't it? Really, what you just said really goes to I suppose, a structural problem in the polity right throughout this, from the moment it started becoming recognised as something that needed the attention of lawmakers, policymakers. There has been this political taxonomy of the issue, of putting it on the left and hostility on the right, which really made no sense, has never really made much sense. But the tendency, therefore, given that taxonomy, has for the rest of the time been for these IPCC reports to come out, other studies, other advocates of change to step forward, and for them to be talking mostly to people who essentially agree with them. And the challenge for our democracy has really been to somehow be persuasive with this issue. That is, to change minds of those people who aren't there. Now, someone earlier on the chat line made the point that apart from the Greens, the other parties, one way or another, have accepted a lot of fossil fuel donations over the years. That is a pretty strong theme that I often hear mentioned. And we know, of course, that this is a factor, not just donations, but the interests that coal and others have in the maintenance of policy as it stands. So it's it has been this big, unswallowable thing for the polity to deal with. And perhaps it's only now starting to come near it. Did you want to make a comment on that, Bronwyn?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I was trying to think what we said in what was reviewed in chapter 16 on decision making, but certainly one of the key structural shifts that is a kind of a lever that shifts community conversation and is media coverage. And speaking outside of the report, but looking at the New Zealand experience, it was getting independent, national, networked stuff. It's called stuff, but it's our national newspapers to agree at an editorial policy level their position on climate, and that then has shifted a conversation dramatically, I think, and there's a lot of research about that. I can't remember what was said in decision making generally about that effect. The other observations that are emerging in the literature and emerging in the research are that it's the requests from boards is coming from and the change in boards is coming both from structural pressure on what they're liable for, but also surprisingly, it's not in the report, but in some of the studies we're doing, and just actually in my observations of businesses that I've been really surprised have asked me to come in, like, why are you asking me? You know, it's been that they've been taken aback by their employees or their family members who are concerned about this. And I don't pretend to understand how you will unlock the conversations in Australia, but once you do, Australia becomes enormously powerful globally. So it is remarkable to me how quickly a political conversation can shift, coming back to the student movement and how it changed the nature of the conversation. Thinking about how media coverage has changed the nature of the conversation, the depth here. We don't have that same, I mean, our epidemiologist colleagues are going through a terrible experience of disinformation, but I think that the dark, difficult periods of climate disinformation have well and truly finished. It's now getting that political commitment and will to move.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And a question for whoever wants to take this, but just a quick one without notice. On that point you made about epidemiologists, I mean, science made a big comeback through the expertise, you know, the value of research and expertise made a big comeback through the pandemic, particularly early on. Australia in particular had, you know, very high levels of observance of social distancing and other measures because people could understand what was being told to them. Governments tucked in behind that advice fairly quickly because they were dealing with something they'd basically not done a lot of thinking about. You know, I wonder, do any of you have optimism that revival of the academy, if I can put it like that, has positive impacts in the climate space as well?
I'll just provide some initial thoughts on that, Mark. Yeah. And I think the issue we have is that this is such a politicized theme in Australia. So unlike the pandemic where it was a new issue for the country. And yeah, I think that it just wasn't a loaded issue and it didn't have the history that we have with climate. I do want to go back though to what Bronwyn was saying around the media, and that was a point I was going to raise as well. And it's really important for us, I think, as authors of the IPCC, to look at the media that we agree to do. And also, I'm really keen to have a look at the analysis of the media over the last couple of weeks and see where the bulk of the requests have come from across the country. I mean, I know most of my requests have come from the ABC and Fairfax, and where I want to be on is you know, Channel 10 or Channel 7 or the Sun Herald or whatever it might be. And it's you know, there is a responsibility for academics in general, though, to be speaking beyond our typical audience. It really is about, and we may not always be the best people to speak, but we need to know who is our broker, who are the academics that are happy to speak. And on your point around the epidemiologists, I've got training in epi, and you know, sometimes we perhaps didn't stay within our own lanes in that way as well, and so we almost risk reducing our legitimacy if we're not the right people to speak on the issue. And then just a final point is around how we see some traction, and I think that this comes back to telling our messages, but also the power of storytelling and the power of narratives. And Bronwyn, you know, you were saying, what is it that it'll take Australia? And you noted the companies that have come to you and requested you to speak. It's because they've had a personal connection. They can tell a story, or someone's told a story to them, and it's resonated. And in fact, that was a key point that came out of this cross-parliamentary group that I spoke to at Parliament in Canberra a couple of years ago. Was we don't need any more facts or figures. We need stories. We need to be able to resonate. We need to hear from communities. We're getting these stories now through the floods. We got them through the bushfires. And yeah, what is the next step? You know, what do we do? And how can we really, once it touches you personally, and you can see with some of the politicians up from the Black Summers, you saw that it touched them personally, and you could almost see this tangible shift in their way they spoke and their their emotion that they connected with. And so it's almost that we all need to be touched in some way, and particularly our decision makers, in order to make the appropriate urgent responses that we need.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Try and scoot through another few questions. Howard Witt writes, given that international commerce works on market mechanisms, is a price on carbon an essential driver for appropriate action? Now, we've had a pretty checkered history with this debate in Australia. Are we, I suppose, a way of adding to that question, are we sort of beyond that? Like, is it just simple? I mean, there's a carbon price at the moment being paid by a lot of people up and down the eastern seaboard, and the rest of the economy is going to have to put its hand pretty deep into the pocket for the repair bill for a number of these things. Now, that's not strictly down to policy in Australia, of course, but it goes to your point, Mark, about we pay one way or another with this anyway. It's not like, I mean, there are costs of inaction, and those costs can be catastrophic.
Yeah, and I think that's right, Mark. And when we sort of look at that sort of perspective, it's not just, in a sense, there is a default, cost of carbon, which can occur through costs for extreme events, or the additional damage caused by extreme events, but also potentially through trade with the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, and I guess and there's a range of other things. So, firstly, the point I'd make is that I think when you ask economists, almost every economist on the planet says, yeah, we need to put a price on carbon. I'd expand that to just say we need to put a price on greenhouse gas emissions, because not all emissions are carbon or carbon dioxide. We have other things in there. And so we need to be comprehensive, just so we don't have points of leakage. But if you do that in a market-based way, it's not a matter of setting, $25. What you do is you limit your number of permits that you can have, and so that's the way you do that, and the market sorts out the price. But the thing is that if you actually set that domestically, if you have a sensible policy, you can actually guide that in ways which are constructive for the broader economy and a broader society. So by how you design those systems, we can, when we take, for example, the price on carbon, turn to the taxpayer. So if you reduce the number of permits, you're often getting taxpayers, or if you hand out permits, people buy them, so you get a tax income. As soon as you actually go to the alternative, which is costs incurred through, say, extreme events, or costs occur through a carbon border adjustment mechanism, the control goes elsewhere and the benefit goes elsewhere. And so it's, if you think of it like that, it's a really dumb thing to do. What you're doing is ensuring that you get the worst of all possible worlds when you actually, essentially outsource your responsibilities for reducing emissions.
Yes, good point. Now, Judy Snyder writes, do the panel members think there is sufficient information in the IPCC report? That has just jumped while I've been reading it, such as the nature of these things. I'll see if I can, there, I've got it back. Is there sufficient information in the report to enable governments to prioritise adaptation actions, or is further research required? What do you think? I mean,
if I could just hop in on that.
Yeah.
One of the things that I was most surprised about was that one of the strongest recommendations is that if you have very limited funding, spend your adaptation on your most vulnerable. It has the highest wellbeing dividends. And for countries to sign that off, that's a pretty clear indication of where to put your time right now. And the other thing was to think for the long term, to invest for the long term now. Rather than what Australia and New Zealand both do, is rebuild for the disasters we've just had.
Yeah, no, that's very good advice. And I think it probably applies regionally, Mark, as well, doesn't it? Because we talk about, the government likes to talk about our Pacific family, but many of the members of our Pacific family are looking for Australia, if I can put it like that, the Pacific family were hoping that Australia would take a more ambitious line on emissions reductions and play a stronger leadership role in driving other countries to that, because these Pacific nations are extremely vulnerable to rising sea levels and severe weather.
Yeah, and I'd say, Mark, that we've known pretty much for 2 decades enough to take sensible action on climate change. So we've known the directions of change, the degrees of change under different scenarios within a reasonable sort of bounds. There's a lot more uncertainty about a lot other things, like how a particular war, Iraq war or the Ukraine war, is going to unfold than there is about climate change. We actually know a lot about climate change and the various aspects of it, but we don't know everything. But you don't need to know everything to make sensible risk-based decisions. And so I'd actually suggest that we've known enough to, in fact, since the mid-90s, that extreme floods are likely to increase in Australia. So we've known enough to stop putting houses in harm's way and people in harm's way, additional houses, and that doesn't cost money. It saves money in the long term. So we can actually make a whole stack of decisions, I think, now which save money rather than cost money to actually take action. And as Bronwyn says, if you've only got a limited resource, you want to maximize your leverage. And so there's a whole stack of things. You look after your vulnerable people, but you also do those things which limit future vulnerability.
Catherine, Mark made the point about EVs before and said that it would have been good if there was subsidy or investment in it, that if that had been done a few years ago, it'd be even better than now. I wonder if you could sort of think about that more broadly. I mean, the Chinese have I think a saying that best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. I wonder if we can look at the policy architecture that is being advocated by people who are concerned about climate change, the policy responses. If we can look back and say, well, if we'd done certain things that we were advocating, that there was some political will to do, perhaps not enough as it turned out, but some political will to do 10, 20 years ago, how much better off would we be now? It's a counterfactual question in a sense. It's one has to theorize about, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, if I think of the context of health, and something that the health sector has been talking about for many, many years is the importance of universal health coverage. And this also has resonance in the Australian and the New Zealand, well, I'm not entirely sure, Bronwyn, with New Zealand, but maybe your mental health services are better than ours. But if we invest in universal health coverage globally, and most of my work is outside of Australia, then we see that the majority of the health impacts of climate change will actually be negated, because really climate change will exacerbate current and underlying health issues. So we'll see issues around malnutrition, around waterborne diseases, cholera, diarrhea, etc., arising from extreme weather events, for example. And these are basic health service provision requirements. So how do we ensure that we have a health system that looks after our health in times of climate change, but it's also going to reap rewards despite the levels of climate change we'll see? So we talk about these win-win arguments. So investing in the prevention, in health, public health, at the same time as ensuring that our sort of tertiary side, so our treatment end, so our hospitals and our healthcare facilities are also appropriately resourced, is a really important focus for the health system. And I think that if we had invested in that 20 years ago globally, and also in the context of Australia, particularly in relation to access to mental health services and early intervention, then we would reap the rewards. And so that's probably sort of the best answer I can give you from a health perspective.
Yeah, no, that's good. But I'm going to take one more question and then we're going to have to wrap up, unfortunately. We've got a few more there in the queue, but it's always the way, very difficult to get through them all. This one's addressed to you, Mark, but I suppose others may want to comment as well. Jenny asks, you've mentioned the impact on food systems. Can you be more specific? Will we be able to feed another 2 billion people in the world? There was a report a couple of days ago that sea level would rise by 25 centimetres by 2050. How many food producing deltas will be inundated by that? Does the report attempt to quantify that food challenge, that fundamental challenge of a growing population and a rapidly deteriorating climate.
Yeah, it does, and so it draws on existing studies, but those existing studies still haven't pulled together all of the different aspects there, such as the changes in availability of land associated with the coasts, and so integrating that with changes in yields in the dry land areas, inland sort of thing. And so I think what we have is a partial view of that particular issue. But I think it's fair to say, if you actually look at the evidence that's happening right now in terms of food, what it shows is that climate change is already dragging back food productivity and profitability right across the globe, with a few exceptions, such as the old USSR and Canada, as the cold environments, which a bit of warming helps agriculture. Pretty much everywhere else is actually being dragged back by climate change, and in some places, particularly those in developed countries, it's actually large. It's well in excess of 20%. So that's at 1.1 degrees. So I think any analysis of that would be very concerning about what it might look like at 2 degrees, given our current systems. Now, our current systems are going to be challenged not just by sea level rise encroaching on high productivity farmland adjacent to our coasts, but also degradation, which tends to increase with climate change, increased rainfall intensity, those sorts of things, but also competition for land from cities and competition from land for things like carbon sequestration or solar panels and similar things. And so there's, and of course, biodiversity, which is, a big part of the picture. And so what I think we're going to see is a lot more competition for agricultural land in the future. And so we're going to have to make a lot better use of those areas which we do farm than we currently do.
I think we're going to have to end there. I hope that that's okay, unless either Catherine or Bron wanted to make a very quick comment on that, but quite happy if you don't, because we're right at the outer extreme of our time. Everyone, thanks for being with us for this very special ANU Melbourne University event, and can I particularly thank our exceptional speakers, Professors Bronwyn Haywood, Catherine Bowen and Mark Howden. I hope that you've enjoyed this and learned from this as much as I have. I think it's just been, you've been so erudite in your comments, and it's such an important topic. You've explained it extremely well, and we've covered a lot of ground here tonight. And I think it's been a really, really valuable session. Also like to give a shout out to Michelle and Mahalani behind the scenes, who did so much work, as you say, Mark, one of your co-authors in respect of some of this. So thank you to all involved. Please, for those of you watching, bear in mind there'll be another report out from the IPCC in early April. That's dealing with mitigation, as I understand it, and details of a similar kind of event, I think, are being finalised as we speak. So that's all from me and ANU, Mark Kenny. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.